You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, Episode 540, Dark Frontier.
Welcome into another episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm John Champion.
And I'm Ryan Britt. Each week on Mission Log, we examine an episode of Star Trek, considering all the opinions of the hive mind, and pick it apart for any morals, meanings, and messages, and then asking ourselves if the whole thing stands the test of time.
This week, Dark Frontier, the one where 7 of 9 gets a visit from her old boss with an offer to come back and work for the company. The benefits aren't great, but there's a real sense of collective purpose. Ryan, welcome to the show. For anybody in our audience who does not know you and your Star Trek CV, give us the nutshell version, if you would, please.
Yeah, so I've been a journalist covering science fiction and Star Trek in specific for about 15 years. I've written for places way back like Tor.com, and more recently for a long time for Inverse, Den of Geek. You've seen me interview Anson Mount and Paul Wesley for Esquire. And then, in 2022, I published the book Phasers on Stun, How the Making and Remaking of Star Trek Changed the World, which was a contemporary, quirky history of the entire franchise, starting at the beginning and going through now, that had kind of an eye towards newcomers, and that was published by Dutton, Plume, Penguin Random House, and they've done my other books, which are the essay collection Luke Skywalker Can't Read, which was in 2015. I always get to laugh, that title. Then my most recent book was A History of Dune, which came out in 2023, which was called The Spice Must Flow.
There we go. And if you are looking for Phasers on Stun, sold at fine book retailers everywhere, like online. So go take a look, and you can find it. And
it's in some bookstores too.
It is. Well, see,
yes.
I hesitate to say bookstores because I can't even tell you where the good bookstores are in LA. I mean, they exist, but it's not like the old days. You just like, oh yeah, I'm going to walk down to Barnes and Noble because there's one at every mall or on every corner. You know, I miss those days. I miss those days of like the miles-long magazine racks. But look for Ryan Britt's books, and in the meantime, why don't you tell folks where to reach us?
Mission Log is a conversation about Star Trek. Find the show at missionlog@roddenberry.com and on X and Facebook at Mission Log Pod. While you're at it, a review and rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform makes a big difference to the podcast you love. Always remember, your comments could be used on Mission Log or engage on the Roddenberry YouTube channel. And I think, John, you have some trivia for this week's episode.
I have just a tiny bit, which I will share with all of you now. So Dark Frontier, and we are talking about Dark Frontier as one episode made up of 2 parts. It was written by Brannon Braga and Joe Menosky. They share the credit for both episodes. Joe gives most of that credit to Brannon, though, for pulling together many ideas involving the Borg and then shaping them into the feature-length story that we get. They scripted it in 2 parts, which, by the way, I had to go back to those scripts for a little bit of clarification. I'll explain in a little while. And then they filmed it in 2 parts, so just fitting it into their normal production schedule, 1 episode at a time. But they always had the intention that this was a single feature-length episode. You may have caught it in syndication later in 2 distinct parts, but the original intention always one time, one shot, feature-length episode. Part 1 was directed by Cliff Bole, longtime Trek director, and the one request that he had for his part was that we had to see the Borg Queen at the end of Part 1 as the ultimate teaser to have the audience come back or stick around for Part 2. Brannon made that accommodation happily, and nice of him to do so. since this is the last episode of Trek directed by Cliff. I mean, he's been around since the early days of TNG, so, right? Yeah, kind of a nice send-off for him. Part 2 was directed by Terry Wendell, and we just talked about Terry not that long ago for the episode Gravity, which was his first for the franchise. And since he was the newcomer, he had a bit of catching up to do and had a crash course in Borg lore, especially pulling from the movie Star Trek First Contact. Makes sense. And this two-parter, aka feature episode, it was written with the purpose of airing during Sweeps Week. So this has now kind of become a thing. Of course, all shows are aware of Sweeps Week, but as that February time rolled around here, they were ready. They were prepping it back in November, December the year before and knew, okay, we got to do something big. It's going to involve the Borg. We don't know exactly what it'll be yet, but we're going to plan, we're going to aim for that. And that's the genesis of this story. By the way, the previous two-parter for Voyager, which would have been The Killing Game, parts 1 and 2, that was seen as a great success, not just by the production staff, but by the powers that be, and of course at UPN. Therefore, we get the go-ahead to get another one here and land it right in Sweeps. A lot of new special effects were created for this episode, including the huge Borg complex. And that was a specific attempt to go beyond the enormity of the Borg that we had seen in the movie First Contact. But where that was an expense, there was some cost savings done by reusing existing elements, like many Borg set pieces, and in fact, the Borg Queen costume was reused from the movie and refit to our actor here. Speaking of, let's meet our guest stars. Well, we get to say welcome back to Scarlett Palmer's as Naomi Wildman. And we have another young actor making an appearance here, and that is Caitlin Peterson as young Annika Hansen. She got a very early start in the business as a child actor and continued to work through adulthood. In addition to her TV appearances, she also works as a voice talent for animation and video games. The Hansens were cast late in the process, and numerous reasons led to recasting these roles with different actors than we had seen before. Magnus was played by Kirk Bailey, and he also had a huge resume of voice work, everything from voicing animated characters to, well, the Transformers movies, to being brought in for ADR and looping work on feature and TV shows. But you may have seen him on screen in Melrose Place or The Larry Sanders Show or Bottle Shock, starring another Trek actor. That would be Chris Pine. And we lost Kirk Bailey back in 2022. Laura Stepp, now credited as Laura Interval, played Erin Hansen. Laura has had recurring roles on soap operas, and she pops up in guest roles since the mid-1990s. You may have caught her in the 1997 feature Spawn, and she will be back for another Trek appearance in Enterprise. And finally, let's meet our Borg queen, Susanna Thompson. Now, interestingly, she auditioned for the role of the Borg queen in First Contact, and she did not get that role at the time. But it is worth pointing out that this role in Dark Frontier of the Borg Queen is specifically scripted as a different Borg Queen than the one that we met in First Contact. Makes sense if you've seen the movie, but that might lead to some headcanon retconning as well. Now, Alice Krieg had been approached to play the role in this episode of Voyager, but she was not available. But still, even if they had gotten Alice, different queen, just keep that in mind. Now, we have met Susanna before, so you can refer back to TNG Seasons 5 and 6 when we covered The Next Phase and Frame of Mind, respectively. Then we met her again in DS9 in the episode Rejoined. So here we can enjoy her take on the Queen, and she will be back for more because the Queen will return.
We're getting more flashbacks to Seven's childhood, and you know what that means. That's still so Raven.
Prologue. The present. A Borg probe ship has detected the USS Voyager. They set a course for assimilation. There's a brief skirmish, but Voyager manages to beam a photon torpedo right inside while shields are down, and the Borg failed to disarm it. The torpedo explodes, taking the entire probe ship with it. Janeway had only intended to disable them, but time to salvage what they can from the wreckage, in hopes of scoring a transwarp coil which could shave years off their journey home. Act 1. Janeway and Chakotay make their way to Cargo Bay 2, where the crew is sifting through the debris. There's good and bad news. They've recovered some useful tech, but the transwarp coil they were hoping to find is unusable. However, there is a silver lining. A couple of Borg data nodes have survived the explosion, and these could be a treasure trove of information. 7 of 9 gets to work decoding them. But first, a stop by the mess hall where Tom and Harry sip beer to celebrate their tactical victory. Tom has egg on his face, though, when he makes an offhand comment about killing a bunch of mindless automatons just as Seven walks through the room. Later, Seven presents Janeway with the translated Borg data. There's a damaged Borg sphere nearby, limping along after an ion storm. Janeway sees this as a golden opportunity and outlines a plan to steal a working transwarp coil from the sphere. Dubbed Operation Fort Knox, a name that Tom has to explain to the others, this mission is all about split-second timing. The plan is simple. Sneak on to the sphere, grab the coil, and get out before the Borg even know they're there. Janeway pulls Seven aside and gives her a special assignment. She wants Seven to dig through her parents' old research logs from the Raven for any tactical advantages they might have missed. Remember, the Hansons were scientists who spent years studying the Borg before they were assimilated, of course. Seven isn't too thrilled about the task. Understandably, she has some baggage when it comes to those logs. They're basically a front-row seat to her childhood trauma. But Janeway insists, so Seven reluctantly agrees. Act 2. As Seven starts sifting through the logs, we flash back to young Annika Hansen playing with a model Borg cube. Her father, Magnus, gently explains that they are about to embark on a mission to study the Borg up close. Soon enough, they detect a real Borg cube which ignores them after an initial scan, so the Hansons follow it from a distance. Back to the present, Voyager closes in on the damaged sphere, and Seven is called to the bridge, where their current pursuit mimics that of her parents some 20-plus years ago. With the clock ticking, Janeway orders double shifts and non-stop simulation drills to prepare the crew for the heist. Act 3. And just how does that simulation go? Janeway, Seven, Tuvok, and Harry make their way through the Borg sphere, armed but not a threat to the Holoborg. They're on a tight schedule, and things go smoothly, mostly, until the Borg suddenly take notice. The away team scrambles to complete their mission, but it's too late. The simulation ends with the team beaming back to Voyager, only to find themselves facing off against Borg drones on the bridge, simulated, of course. Back in the real world, Janeway checks in with Seven, who froze up during the simulation. It's clear that her time as a drone is still haunting her, and Janeway wonders if she's pushing Seven too hard. But Seven insists that she'll be fine and promises to hold it together when it counts. Later, as Seven continues to dig through her parents' logs, she's visited by Naomi Wildman. Naomi's innocent questions about the Borg hit a little close to home for Seven, who eventually snaps at the child. But then things take a turn for the surreal. Naomi's face morphs as a Borg implant appears, and suddenly Seven is surrounded by drones. It's a nightmare, but it feels real. The Borg Collective has tapped into Seven's neural transceiver. Voiced by the Borg Queen, they have a message. Rejoin the Collective, or Voyager will be destroyed. This is no ordinary threat. The Borg want Seven back because, as they ominously tell her, she's unique. Act 4. Flashback aboard the Raven again, where the Hansons have followed a Borg cube into the Delta Quadrant. Using some clever tech, a biodampener, they've managed to study the Borg up close, even naming a few along the way without getting caught. Magnus even spends long hours on board the cube, watching drone behavior and learning everything he can. In the present, Seven shares her parents' designs for the biodampener with Tuvok and the Doctor. These devices could be the key to completing the mission within the tight time frame. But Seven's feelings about her parents are complicated. She's not exactly thrilled to be following in their footsteps, especially since their obsession with the Borg led to her own assimilation. The Doctor tries to cheer her up, but Seven's pain rises to the surface. Her parents' arrogance, she believes, cost her everything. With Operation Fort Knox ready to go, Janeway makes a last-minute change. She's taking Seven off the away team. But Seven isn't having it. She insists that she's the best person for the job, and after some heartfelt pleading, Janeway relents. Seven is back on the team. Act 5. Operation Fort Knox begins. Voyager sends out a shuttle as a decoy, hoping to lure the Borg's fear into lowering its shields. But the Borg aren't biting. Janeway comes up with a new plan, boost the shuttle's warp signature to make it more tempting. The Borg take the bait, and the away team beams aboard the sphere. As the team moves through the sphere, Seven starts to hear that haunting Borg Queen voice again, urging her to rejoin the collective. After securing the transwarp coil, Seven hesitates when it's time to go back to Voyager. When Janeway orders her to move, Seven has some news of her own. She wants to stay. Janeway is stunned and refuses to leave her behind, but before she can act, a force field separates them. Seven warns Janeway to leave or be assimilated. When Janeway, Tuvok, and Chakotay are beamed back to Voyager, the Borg sphere enters a warp conduit and disappears into a massive Borg complex. There, the Queen greets Seven, "Welcome home." Act 6. The Borg Queen begins manipulating Seven right away by pointing out her unique nature and revealing that the collective allowed Voyager to steal her in the first place. Seven wants answers, but the Queen orders her to regenerate before further conversation. Meanwhile, on Voyager, there's progress integrating the transwarp coil and a little light invasion of privacy on B'Elanna's part. Janeway is frustrated by Seven's betrayal, and Chakotay speculates that Seven might have been planning it all along. Janeway remains skeptical, insisting that Seven saw Voyager as her new collective. Neelix, assisting with the cleanup of the captured Borg debris, asks if Seven's alcove should be shut down, but Janeway refuses. In her ready room, Janeway discovers an anomaly in the sensor logs from their operation to steal the transwarp coil, evidence that the Borg had been communicating with Seven before her departure. She's visited by Naomi Wildman, who has her own plan for rescuing Seven, and Janeway reassures her that she will never abandon a missing member of the crew. Back in the Borg complex, the Queen continues her efforts to persuade Seven, revealing that they need her for her human perspective to assist in assimilating all of humanity. When Seven resists, the Queen begins the assimilation of a new species, 10026, forcing Seven to witness as nearly 400,000 lives are threatened. Act 7. In the past, Magnus and Aaron Hansen continue their study of the Borg and their Queen. They are surprised when they examine a newly redesignated drone that it used to work in close proximity to the Queen herself. Magnus takes a closer look at the drone's transceiver logs. In the present, Chakotay discovers that the signals Janeway found in the sensor logs match those recorded by the Hansens years ago, confirming the Queen's influence on Seven. So it's time to rally the crew again, this time for a long-range rescue mission. The Delta Flyer, equipped with the stolen transwarp coil and Hansen's multi-adaptive shielding, sets off after the Borg sphere with Janeway, Tom, Tuvok, and the Doctor. Chakotay stays in command of Voyager, just on the other side of the transwarp conduit. Act 8. As the Flyer is on its way, the Queen manipulates Seven into assisting with the assimilation of species 10026, despite her reluctance. Seven is horrified by what she sees in the mass assimilation, and she saves a small group of individuals. Once they are safely on an escape ship, she re-enters the Queen's chamber. The Queen knows what happened, though, and she asks Seven to decide if they should be assimilated or she should destroy the ship. Seven says neither and pleads for their release. The Queen takes a pause and then releases the ship. Act 9. Years ago on the Raven, their attempts at camouflaging themselves are failing, and a Borg cube closes in, terrifying young Annika. That's the passage in the Raven's logs that Janeway is reading when we cut back to the present aboard the Delta Flyer. The Doctor has a bit of good news that he has isolated Seven's interplexing beacon, which may allow them to send a message directly to her. Just then, Tom spots the Borg sphere some 200 light-years away. Adaptive shielding goes online, and it's time to drop out of transwarp. The Borg Queen reveals to Seven her plans to assimilate humanity through a viral attack, a method which she demands Seven to assist by programming the nanoprobes. Seven's defiance grows, but the Queen tries to break her spirit, using the memory of Seven's family, particularly her father Magnus, who has been assimilated into the collective and now appears before her as a drone. Seven is on the edge of surrender, but then she hears Captain Janeway's voice through the interplex link. The voice startles her for a moment, and she blurts out, "Captain," which the Queen follows with, "Janeway." Act 10. Aboard the Delta Flyer, Janeway and the Doctor realize their communication link to Seven has been severed, and a Borg cube has set a course toward them, signaling that the Queen is aware of their presence. Tuvok locates Seven's position, and Paris sets a course. The Queen uses the assimilated knowledge of the Raven to adapt their scanners, but Janeway quickly orders shields to be remodulated, throwing them off the path. The Queen indicates to Seven that the flyer has been captured, but the lie is easily uncovered since the crew's presence has not been assimilated into the hive mind. As the Delta Flyer approaches, Janeway decides to take action, ordering Tuvok to join her to beam in. Equipped with biodampeners, Tuvok gets to work disabling the shield around the Queen's chamber, while Janeway awakens a drone and disables the smaller force field around them. Meanwhile, the Queen continues to manipulate Seven by capturing the Delta Flyer and a tractor beam, threatening Seven that she will assimilate the shuttle and its crew. Janeway walks toward the chamber, armed, and threatens the Queen that the flyer will fire its full torpedo complement at the room unless the Queen lets them and Seven go. The Queen disables a tractor beam, but erects a dispersal field around the room. But Seven's loyalties are with Janeway, and she lowers the field from a control panel only to have the Queen adapt and raise it again, preventing them from beaming out. But with Seven's instruction, Janeway disrupts the Queen's control systems with a phaser blast, causing the force field to collapse long enough for Janeway, Seven, and Tuvok to be beamed out. The flyer enters transwarp, followed closely by a Borg vessel in pursuit. The shuttle takes heavy fire but escapes the conduit intact. They signal Voyager with an update, and Chakotay orders fire at the threshold of the transwarp conduit, preventing the Borg vessel from arriving in one piece. Back on Voyager, the transwarp coil is integrated with their systems and shaves another 20,000 light-years off the journey home. And in the cargo bay, Seven works to download her newly accumulated data about the Borg. Janeway enters, reassuring her about her place in the crew, which is why they came back for her. But first, she needs to take a nap. Captain's orders. The end. Coming out of the recap, I have a kind of a weird note that I did not include in trivia, but I alluded to it in trivia. So remember how I mentioned that it was written as a two-parter, but then always intended to be aired together as a feature length? Okay, act breaks. Weird or non-existent act breaks in certain places. And I went back to the original scripts in our archive so I could flip from page to page where it's, end of Act 2, beginning of Act 3. For example, in Part 1, end of Act 1, leading into Act 2, that is the moment that Janeway assigns Seven to go look through the Raven's logs, right? But that was also supposed to have a cut where you see the Borg sphere on Janeway's monitor and then go, and that just got cut out. And I don't know if it was...
Because it's just Neelix walks in with a bunch of iPads.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All the stacks and stacks of iPads.
No other way that she can go through it. And he's
not at all. No. Yeah.
I like how he's like, I've organized them. And it's like...
I know.
It's like even in Star Trek, that feels like silly.
Don't you have folders?
He had different iPads he had different, I shouldn't say iPads. He had different pads for each, like he was like, this is research and this is purely biographical, like I was kind of like, first of all, is Neelix taking that would have taken forever.
Oh yeah.
Like that means that Neelix also read all of it?
I know.
So doesn't Neelix also? So at the point at which Neelix could make that little tray that he brings in, organize all of it, does that mean that he already knows more than Seven does about what's in there? And if so, is Neelix just like a genius that we just were unaware of? Right?
Pretty much, yeah. Because Seven could, in theory, just download all of that information.
And Neelix has just been like serving Tom and Harry beers.
Beer, right?
They've been having beers. So Neelix had a beer with Tom and Harry. He was cooking. And then he's like, I'm going to read all of this. And then I'm going to organize it by taxonomy, the Talaxian taxonomy. Yeah, right. I was just like, what is that made me laugh so much in rewatching it, because nothing you would ever notice at the time. You're like, oh yeah, he organized it. That's nice.
Yeah.
So
and
so
now
funny.
what you do is you'd open up a folder on your computer, you'd grab all the documents, you throw them into the ChatGPT and say, please organize this.
Or you just or even before
keyword
ChatGPT.
search.
Right, like you could just do a command find. You know what I mean? Like, I like that Star Trek doesn't have I like that they have a separate pad for their reading and a separate. Yeah. They don't read off their tricorder. Not everybody's glued to their tricorder. Right. I like that because I do that too. Like my wife is always like, I use this iPad for art and that's it. And I'm like, and I use this laptop for fiction and that's it. So I like that Star Trek has that, because also they're in space. Their Wi-Fi might suck. So things have to, so maybe there is like a need to move the data. Maybe they don't maybe have, wireless is probably not good in space.
Maybe that might be the case.
I don't know what the canosity of Wi-Fi is.
Always go hardwired when you can.
But yeah, I mean that's the great thing about Data, right? Is that he's not in the cloud, right? That he's hardwired.
Yes.
And that's why the Borg are kind of lame, right? It's because they're the cloud. Like they have all their data is in the cloud.
So right. You are so right.
That is their weakness, is that they don't actually have any endemic knowledge, right? It's all in the cloud.
And the Wi-Fi goes down and they're helpless.
And every time.
Like us.
Every time. Season 3 of Picard, what did they do? They blew up the router. Right. They got Jack out of there. They blew up the router. The ChatGPT got shut down. Everybody got their jobs back. But yeah, I mean, I do think about this a lot with the Borg, where people are always like, Data, and the different AI. I don't know. Anyway, more to discuss. But Neelix
I love this train of thought. This is great.
Neelix bringing the pads just made me crack up, but I loved it at the same time.
And that is the scene. That is the transition there, which is very weird. But yeah, depending on how you watch the episode, maybe I can't remember if on the DVD set they are separated as 2 episodes or not. They may only be one.
Well, I should
Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, watching the edit as a feature, those act breaks are going to be off by a little bit or non-existent. Like if you go to Memory Alpha and you read it there, you might find that those act breaks appear a little bit different to you. So that's why it's a little strange for this one.
I wanted to ask you a question though, John. Yeah. Is that about the idea that it was a telemovie? Mm-hmm. Is as far as, other than the series premieres, right, of the Next Generation and DS9 and Caretaker for Voyager and Broken Bow for Enterprise, is this the only time a non-season premiere aired as like a quote-unquote 2-hour movie?
Oh, okay. The Killing Game aired as the 2 parts back-to-back.
But they aired on the same night.
Yeah. But if I'm not mistaken, those appeared as separate parts, and then you got the last time on Voyager.
So you would get the title sequence. It's not like All Good Things, where where I watched it when it aired, and there was no All Good Things Part 2. It was just All Good Things, right?
Exactly.
So Dark Frontier was like that. It just said Dark Frontier, because when I watched it on Paramount Plus, I was like, it had the credits for Part 1 and Part 2, and I'd forgotten that it was that was the whole thing. And obviously it's only like an hour and 45 minutes because there's no commercials now.
Right.
But it would have been it would have been 2 hours.
Oh, they would have stretched that out with so many ads.
It would have been but it would have been like a 2 hour but they never did that again, right? Like in that exact format for any of the shows.
See, here's the thing. Voyager at this point then gets kind of emboldened with the 2-parters. Now, I don't think any of them aired as a feature length beyond this point, but they definitely leaned into that 2-parter thing. And that was something that I feel like, from my understanding of the behind the scenes here, Brandon wanted to lean into, because, we have this freedom to build kind of bigger, more complex stories, do something really impressive, really epic, because because, at this point with DS9 wrapping up and they were doing these massive arcs, it's like, hey, can't we do a little bit of that too? In the early days of Voyager, the edict had come down saying, no, these are standalone, episodic, that's it. So I think they're trying to have a little bit of their cake and eat it here too.
But it had been a while since First Contact was out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to me that, like, now, if you were like, this came out 2 years ago and it was a movie that wasn't actually part of this show and with different characters.
Right.
But we're going to, like, reference all that, but also recast.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It would be like, it'd be like if Marvel brought back Thanos on one of the new Marvel shows, but recast Josh Brolin.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It would be like in that if Terry Matalas is doing that new Vision show, right?
Yeah.
So it'd be like if Terry Matalas' new Vision show had a new Thanos not played by Josh Brolin. That's what this is like.
That's a big deal.
It's really interesting that they because it was, like you said, it was a scheduling thing.
Yeah. Yep.
We've had 3 canonical Borg queens, Alice Krige, Susanna Thompson, Annie Wershing, from Picard season 2, but this was the first time that we said we could have a new Borg queen, and that it's not just a recasting. They could have just said it was a recasting, but they wanted it to be, I when it aired, I remember not really noticing, frankly, because I didn't. It was only later when Krieg came back for Endgame that I was like, oh, they've been using a different Borg queen. Right. She's not exactly the George Lazenby, right? But she does a pretty good impression of Alice Krige in a sense. And I have read some stuff with her saying that she had tried to distinguish it, but that she also used Alice Krige as a baseline. And then when you're like, oh, this is the same actress who was Dax's former lover in Rejoined, you're like, wait a minute, that's not the same person. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that she's a phenomenal actress.
Yeah.
Because I was fooled into thinking she was Alice Krige. And then also I had Rejoined is such a huge DS9 episode, so groundbreaking. Of course, that's not the same person that played the Borg Queen, but it is. Right. So I don't know. I just think there's something incredible about that recasting that just is like, I'm like, wow, that was some, what a swing to take. You like they would never done it with Q, right?
Yeah.
They would have never been like, oh, and now Q is being played by the guy who played Balky in Perfect Strangers.
I would like to see that episode, though.
Bronson Pinchot.
Pinchot,
he could be a good Q.
He would be a wonderful Q. Bring him in. He was in the new Beverly Hills Cops. He's still got it. Yeah, he does. Yeah. Well, you hit something really important there about Susanna Thompson's portrayal here, which, yes, you said it exactly right, that she was inspired by First Contact, inspired by Alice Kriege's portrayal of this role, but then also told this is a different character and you can interpret it differently. You can do your own things. And yet we're still trying to maintain this kind of interesting bit of balance to say they're similar but different. And maybe if you're not paying that close attention, you watch it and you get it immediately. You get it because the look is the same, the costume is the same, the introduction with the effects and the spine, like all of that reminds you of First Contact. But I also think that when we talk about kind of the Borg as a whole, the Borg at large, I like this idea of having multiple and different queens. I think that's good for understanding the role of the queen here. I want to move on a little bit and just talk about some of the other strange and interesting things that are happening in this episode or these combined episodes. You mentioned it a moment ago that Tom and Harry are in the mess hall having a beer. And that's the moment that 7 of 9 comes in. And wow, she walks in right when the Borg are getting dissed. And yeah, it's a little uncomfortable. First of all, kind of funny that Tom and Harry are in their costumes that just have a little dirt smudges on them. Like they're fine. They don't look sweaty at all. But oh, we've been working hard. Look at the little smudges on our outfits, But then 7 comes in, and that is an uncomfortable. Like here's Tom just not knowing how to keep his mouth shut, Yeah,
it's an interesting bit of continuity, though, with First Contact, because he has that thing where he's like, well, we did them a favor, they were mindless drones. Yeah. Right, which is the same thing Picard says, right, if you in First Contact, where if you encounter Enterprise crewmen crew members who have already been assimilated that you'll be doing them a favor.
And he
don't
straight up
hesitate to
kills
fire.
one.
And which is also sort of like, yeah, but you're only alive because we didn't do that, Jean-Luc. But whatever. But they do make an interesting distinction in this episode that I'm not sure. You can correct me if I'm wrong. If it had been made before, between members of the collective that have been assimilated and members of the collective that are just drones. Right. And like there seems to be like a slight distinction they're making there, which was interesting in First Contact when the Borg Queen is like, he'll make an excellent drone. You're not going to be a cool Borg.
Yeah.
You're just going to be a drone. So this idea that that there's been something in Starfleet that has been passed down, that killing the drones is a mercy kill. Yeah. And that Voyager has only started to unpack that prejudice because of Seven. Right? That the Starfleet is still deeply prejudiced about, they don't probably know about Hugh. Does Tom Paris know about Hugh? That's probably classified.
Definitely not. Yeah.
That's real classified, right? Like, Tom Paris doesn't know about Hugh. He doesn't know about what Hugh's projects of, they probably don't know about the Lore's rogue Borg. That's got to be classified.
Yeah, probably don't know much about Locutus. I mean, like, they know that Locutus existed, but they probably don't understand the hierarchy.
And then you've probably got people who are like conspiracy theorists who are like, well, it was clearly an inside job. They had the cars leading it. I love when Lower Decks made that joke. Because I've been making that joke for years with colleagues of mine of like, Wolf 359 was an inside job. And then they did it in Lower Decks, and I was like, oh, that's so good. But yeah, I think that getting back to the canosity of it is that, yeah, it's like I always dislike seeing Tom Paris be annoying. I mean, he's kind of conservative, right? Like, he's a conservative character. Like, I mean that with like a lowercase c, not like a politically, but like that he's like a chauvinist in the opening scenes of Caretaker, flirting with people, and he's kind of this weird, that there's all these people in Starfleet that are kind of like that they're kind of like these really, which I don't know if you think about this a lot, but I want to ask you this, John, because we're talking about Tom Paris and how he steps in it and how he's insensitive, is that there's this thing in the motion picture novelization and Roddenberry's motion picture novelization, where the people in Starfleet are actually not the most progressive advanced people because they had to send out kind of the more sort of average humans because those people were able to make. So there's this idea to me that Tom Paris, particularly, he was a prisoner and he was all this stuff, that he's maybe part of Starfleet that's kind of a lower decker in a way where he's not concerned about being enlightened about the Borg. Yeah. Because as far as he's concerned, that massacre just happened.
Yeah. And that fits, honestly, because you have so many people in Starfleet who either don't have families or at least they don't have strong family connections. They're kind of out there. And sure, I can volunteer for a 5 or 10 or longer year mission, and it's fine. It's fine. I can just go do that on my own because I don't have anything else holding me back here. So that, I think all of that works really well. Got to ask you, were you a little bit disappointed that they called their Operation Fort Knox and not Operation Grand Slam?
Operation Grand Slam. What about Operation Grand Slam? Yeah, it's so funny. I just finished rereading Goldfinger, the novel. And so when I saw the Fort Knox stuff, I was like, what? What's going on here?
I was waiting for somebody to push a button in the conference room table to have the model rise up to the bottom. Yeah. We had. I mean, that would have been great. Yeah, but it's so funny. Like there's all that funny stuff with Voyager that is so delightfully clunky. Yeah, like there's a delightful, but I think you had some thoughts on the gold standard in the 22nd century. What's all that about? Well, I kind of wondered about that. Like, first of all, what do you do with all the gold? Like, it was a funny reference that you've got Tom saying a couple of Ferengi tried to break in 10 years ago and steal. And like, of course, they hear that it was valuable at some point. We'll go get this and we can make all the gold pressed latinum we want because now we've got the gold. So I love that is still part of the lore. And but it's interesting that now we put a date to ending an economy that has money. And I like it when Star Trek drops these little references like, here's the date of Irish unification, and here's the date, well, I hope not, of World War III. And here, we have these future things, but then here's another future thing to look forward to is the this is when we gave up money.
Yeah, I mean, but now that Romulan operative from Strange New Worlds has messed up the timeline so much that Khan is, living in Toronto or whatever, so I don't know. Now they probably got rid of the gold standard, like, right before Kirk was born.
So we've got a lot to talk about when we get into the Borg action. And, you've got really a couple of sequences. You have the simulation, and then you have the actual heist that they try to pull off. And I always wonder, when it comes to a simulation and or the real thing, how do you know? How do you know you're going to get ignored this time? Like, how do you know that huge giant phaser rifle you're carrying around isn't going to get noticed, or that, the timing that you've allotted, it'll take them 2 minutes to fix the shields. What if it takes them 60 seconds? So there's a lot of this stuff that I feel like, I can't get too bogged down in the details of this episode, but there's always an excuse. Like, we'll be ignored if we're not a threat. We'll be ignored if they don't need our technology. We'll be ignored if this. Oh, but we will get snatched up if this, and this. Like, I don't trust it.
Well, I mean, there is a lot of, again, like, in terms of the Borg's behavior, there's a lot of retcon in this episode.
Yeah.
Obviously the biggest Borg retcon ever is in Best of Both Worlds, when Shelby and Picard are quickly like, I thought they were only interested in our technology. Their goals seem to have changed. Boom. Huge retcon. Like, and then now retroactively, they were always assimilating biological and adding their, biological distinctiveness to their own. But here, I mean, we get a lot of Borg retcon with when people were even aware. I mean, I guess that's previous from the Raven, right? Like, the Raven established that as well. The first episode about Seven's parents.
Yeah, and you could... So I did read this later on, that Joe Menosky said, look, we were going to break this bit of continuity anyway because we felt strongly enough about the story. But he made a case that you could go back to the movie Star Trek Generations and say that the Elarians who knew about the Borg, they could have shared that information with Starfleet. Okay, then you have to make the jump and say that Picard didn't know anything about them and nobody else on the Enterprise D knew about them, so this was their first chance to actually come face to face. So maybe it was this rumor, this bit of information that had gotten picked up.
You know how they could have fixed it in this episode, in Dark Frontier? They could have had Seven's parents calling them something other than the Borg.
Oh, that would have been
They could have
incredible.
had some silly name for them.
Yeah. Oh, that would have been amazing.
That's what, because like in Enterprise, where like they don't say their name.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like they could have done something like that, where they could have just called them something else. Because they would have had, because they're like the guerrilla researchers, and they're coming up with names for these things they're researching in the wild. So they could have come up with their own name for them.
Oh, that's interesting. You could have come up with
and then it's fixed.
Yeah, you could have come up with a place that they ended up, like the other end of a transwarp conduit. Like, oh, hey, look, we discovered this thing. They're going away. We're going to follow them. By the way, Magnus, when he's on the Borg cube, biodampener, of course, we have to have that for this story to work. That's an interesting little thing that we allow ourselves for the episode. He's still walking around talking out loud and literally wearing a flashing red light. And I just wondered, like, even if he's got the biodampener, there's no Borg walking around like, did you hear that? Did you see that? Did I? It's just a little obvious.
I do love that though about the Borg. I have to say, though, I know we were kind of making fun of it a little bit, but I do love that starting with Hugh, like forward, that the Borg are so immersed in their cloud that real life inputs are less important, which is exactly like phubbing, right? People are on their phones and they can't hear you, they can't see you. You know, and so it's like the Borg are texting while driving, and that's why that works, right? It's because that's their whole culture, is texting while driving, and so of course if you beam onto their ship, because they're just like, you've had this conversation with your friend or significant other where they're like looking at something on their phone and they didn't even hear what you said. That's the Borg all the time. That's why I think the Borg are such an enduring metaphor, because it was so prescient. You know what I mean? It's such an enduring metaphor, because you're like, it's kind of unrealistic. This guy's got a flashy red light. I was like, I don't know. I've been looking at a cat video on my phone and not heard what my wife said one time. So you could kind of get it. It's like if you extrapolate it, of course that's not what they based it on, but it would actually probably makes more sense now
Right.
than it did in the 90s. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Speaking of watching cat videos, I have to assume that that's what the Borg Queen is doing every time right before she makes an entrance. Because I always wonder, like, what is the benefit of just being in pieces and then somebody walks into the room and you're like, hang on, here come my legs, here come my arms.
One moment, please.
Yeah, here's my head on a metal spine.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of love it though, because like I love that thing in did you I don't know, I'm sure you've seen the Ron Moore Battlestar Galactica.
Oh yeah.
But I love that thing in the last season where the Dean Stockwell Cylon is like, I don't want to have a body. I want to experience, whatever he says, taste quasars and stuff, where he's like a advanced cybernetic being or whatever they are. They're just artificial intelligence, I guess. But
yeah,
that's interesting to me because it's always like with the Borg, just like she's so beyond it that she's actually kind of doesn't like being in a body, which is sort of contradicted by like her whole way of wanting to, talk to Data about stuff. But
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, maybe it's a drag for other previous Borg queens to get in the body. Maybe they've just been like, so it's like a tradition. One Borg queen was like, this being in a body sucks. So.
Yeah.
I don't know. Right? Like,
that could be.
Lots of headcanon in this one.
It's fair enough.
For us, yeah.
There's so much in this episode that I like about Seven, and I feel like, for a series that was designed to be very episodic, and you don't always get a lot of character growth, there is a consistency to the path that Seven has been on and continues to be on. So even a simple line like, the Borg Queen confronts her about her sarcasm and humor, and Seven says, "My humor is my own." It says so much by saying so little that Seven is aware of her humor. She is aware of the response that it gets. And it just kind of reinforces these little nods that we've had before where you wonder, like, hang on, does she know she's making a joke here or not? And like, yeah, she's still the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, it's something that's really great. I also wanted to say about, I think that for as many great things as we say about Jeri Ryan, that she's still slightly underrated.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about Brent Spiner and Leonard Nimoy. They had these constraints for their characters. And obviously Nimoy invented a lot of his and created a lot of the Spock character. But with Brent Spiner, a lot of that was kind of baked into like what Data could and couldn't do. But Seven almost has fewer restraints for the actor. So she kind of had to invent... where like when she gets insulted by Tom and she's like, well, a mindless drone wouldn't understand, where she like she has comebacks and stuff, and it all seems to be kind of created. The timing is really excellent from Jeri Ryan, and and the fact that that she acknowledges that she's not funny on accident in the same way that Spock was not funny on accident when he said funny things. Right. Data was kind of funny on accident, right? Like he kind of accidentally made jokes, but like Seven is more like Spock in that way, is that she's aware that, fun will now commence is funny.
Right.
She knows that that's funny. Yeah. I think it's great. That was a great observation, John.
It's the right combination, I think. Of course, all credit due to Jeri Ryan she could get for, as you said, being kind of maybe underrated, underappreciated here. I think it's the right combination, though, of actor and writer. Yeah. Like the writers knowing how to write for this character. And what a blessing to the writers to discover, like, oh, wait, we have this character that we can do so much with. And they really lean into it. Unfortunately, other characters get left in the dust when that happens, but it's just so rich. There's so much to get out of her. Did you wonder when we meet species 10026, like, we hear screaming in the background, but then there's a lot of them just kind of walking around, just sort of staring into space. And I don't think they've been assimilated yet, but they're not reacting to anything. These were very strange scenes to me. Was it just because if we saw them screaming on camera, it'd be too distracting, or what?
I guess my thing has always been that those nanoprobes have different, they work differently for different people. Okay. Some people immediately just kind of get zoned. So maybe the nanoprobes are already in the people that are just staring, right? Mm-hmm. And that they worked on them right away, and the people that were screaming were resisting a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the funny thing about the Borg is they say resistance is futile, and then maybe they get hit with the nanoprobes. There's got to be like 30% of the people that are like, all right.
Yeah.
You know, we
Cool.
assume that if the Borg came and they were like resistance is futile, that in the entirety of humanity would rise up and say no, it's not. But what if like there's 30% of people that are like, all right.
I think you might be right.
You know, and I think that, but I think that's again, that's the power of the Borg as metaphor is that, and that's why the whole thing with Seven is always so great because even in Voyager, right, like part of her identity is wrapped up in the fact that she was Borg.
Yeah.
And this episode I think is interesting because it's like I am Annika Hansen, and they play with that in Voyager a lot.
Yeah.
Where like that comes back in Unimatrix Zero, where she's like I'm Annika again, you know. But then by the time we get to Picard, right, like her having been a Borg is part of her identity. It's like she owns the trauma of it, right? And like in the same way, which goes right back to Scorpion Part 2, where she's like, I didn't want you to take me out of the collective, like, screw you, Janeway. Like, this is not fair. But I think that within all of that, it's the idea that there is something really appealing. And that Picard and Seven talk about that, about how there's euphoria, where there's something really appealing about being part of the collective, and that a lot of people in real life probably would sign up. Again, like you made a joke that, you know, at the beginning that her old bosses wanted her back, but there is something, she's not like really tempted in a way that like, you know, Anakin Skywalker is tempted or something.
I mean, we know how this is going to play out, but still,
The Dark Frontier is like, this is the Janeway 7 show now. Janeway is a badass now. This is this is now Voyager. Like,
right.
And I think that is all very strong. And I remember the first time I saw it just being like, wow, this show has really learned how to kick some ass.
Yeah,
and,
right.
And it's also so refreshing to think when it was on that essentially by Dark Frontier that you had just two female leads. And that was what it is. And then the villain was also a woman. You know, and like you couldn't really have imagined that in DS9 and TNG. Like just a few years prior, you couldn't have really imagined that, as you said, the Sweeps Week episode, and it's basically anchored by three female leads.
Yeah.
And that's just something that's really cool. And like, you know, Marvel and Star Wars pat themselves on the back when they do that. And, you know, in the 2020s, and you're like, Star Trek's been doing this, you know, forever.
There we go.
You know, so but I think that getting back to with the people being assimilated, that's my take is that some people are pro assimilation.
Pro assimilation. I love it. All right. This is, boy, that's depressing. Last question here for you. When the Borg Queen is showing that humanity is their real target and trying to recruit Seven to develop this virus, and here's how we're going to assimilate them, how did they pick this guy, the holographic Chad in his underwear, to represent human? I have so many questions. I think that's just very strange.
They want to make us feel bad.
It would have made you and me feel like, no, assimilation.
Look,
this
is what it's like now. If you got assimilated, it's a little better. A little better. This is clearly, I mean, I do think that the Borg offer like that was, I think, the one great idea in Star Trek Picard Season 2 is when Alison Pill's Borg Collective. Right, like where she has like the peaceful Borg collective, like the hippie Borgs, where you're kind of like, there is something appealing about this guy looks ridiculous, but what if no one cared?
Yeah, right.
What if we were just all the same?
But see, that's what's really interesting about the Borg, though, is there is this possibility that it really is just about the programming. So the idea of having collective thoughts that potentially has this route for a positive outcome. I remember Chakotay meeting the Borg farmers,
right?
And they were fine. They really were. Maybe still somewhat misguided. He did need to get out of there. But it really is just a matter of the programming. Once they've decided on what their drive will be and what their goals will be, being a collective isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's only when the programming says, okay, we're a collective, but also we're going to take over everything in sight, that then becomes a problem.
I also think that there's something that Star Trek posits through the lens of other alien species, that there is something in the Star Trek mythos that is unique about humanity, because we have the elements of various other species, right? where it's like, and obviously we know that the progenitors made everybody and et cetera, but that, Mike McMahon said this, that for a long time, Star Trek kind of depicted alien races as kind of one trait, right? That like Vulcans were this way, Ferengi were this way, but obviously within those species, you'd have to imagine that there's a lot of diversity of personality. But I think that Star Trek generally argues that the species that has the most dynamic sort of spectrum of being interesting and unpredictable is humanity.
Yeah.
Because the Vulcans are like always like surprised, and the Q continuum is surprised. So I think the Borg have a chip on their shoulder about humanity because humanity has been the hardest one. Yeah. Has been the hardest one. And like even the El-Orians were kind of like, whatever. They were like, maybe we're not worth assimilating because they talk too much or they listen. I don't know, whatever they did. But I don't know. But I think that you have to believe that in Star Trek that and I think Enterprise did a good job of this, is that for the most part, but like when the ship starts moving out, they're like, wow, humans are really interesting, and they're surprising, and they surprise you constantly in a way. I always loved that thing in Lord of the Rings where like Gandalf's always sort of surprised by hobbits, and I feel like the humans are the hobbits of the Star Trek mythos. They're underdogs always, and so when they win, the like big powers like the Borg or the Q continuum were like, what the hell? These are like jokes. They're like the hobbits, philosophically speaking.
How can you have an episode with a heist on a Borg ship and not call it Ocean's 11 of 9?
All right, Ryan, let's talk about some of the heavy, meaty stuff that comes up in here. And I almost ask, like, where do we even start? Because there are a few things that jump to mind right away. First and foremost, and the Doctor really points this out, especially to the captain, and it is referenced a couple of times in the show. What were the Hansons thinking bringing their child along on this dangerous mission? Now, I get it that in the 24th century, there are families on starships. Those are still dangerous places for families to be in some respect. You don't know where the Enterprise D is going to end up, and there are kids and puppies on board because we've seen it all many, many times in the show. But maybe it's because we already know that the Borg are dangerous, and maybe are we supposed to give the Hansons a little bit of benefit of the doubt, thinking they don't know if they're dangerous or not? What's going on here?
Yeah, I think that this is where our previous idea of like maybe have the Hansons give the Borg a different name, have the Hansons have a false impression of the Borg. I think that they're not. The episode could have done a better job in making them more ignorant of, or rather that the Hansons have a separate narrative that they've established.
Yeah.
They're not dangerous, It's like people, it's like dogs. There's two types of people. There's people that are like, all pit bulls are fine, and other people who are like, some pit bulls are actually still really dangerous.
Yeah.
And I think that the Hansons are people that own a bunch of pit bulls. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And you know what? We've also established that there are a lot of good intentions that the Borg have. And some Borg are great. 7 of 9. Hugh, Alison Pill's Borg. I'm sorry, I have to always call her Alison Pill and not Dr. Girardi. Dr. Girardi's Borg, right? Yeah. I think that that's the thing, is that we're supposed to think of them as nature conservationists who are sort of like, they're kind of, I don't want to say hippies, but they're, people do this all the time, where like there's people that are like bring their kids on expeditions or whatever. Right. I mean, not as much in maybe contemporary society, but there's certainly historical examples of, people taking children into dangerous situations because that's where their job was. I think that my biggest problem with the Hansons are their clothes. Is that
you're not wrong? Yeah,
we're like in that thing where they didn't figure out civilian clothes yet. I don't think they really figured it out until Picard season 1. Yeah, with the franchise, honestly, I just like the thing that takes me out of the episode more than just the ethical stupidness of parents bringing their kid on the ship because I mean, I would never do it. I'm a parent. It's insane. But the thing that takes me out of it from a reality point of view is just what they're wearing. It's just like, because there's a part where she's like playing with something that's clearly just like the Borg Playmates toy.
Yes,
it's like it's like the Borg cube that you could buy at Toys R Us at that time. She's like playing with it, and he's like, "Don't play with it." And I'm like, "Well, I have one.
It's a toy. It's meant to be played with." Yeah. By the way, I hate to give a note to a child actor, but look, the Borg cubes, they do not go zoom. You don't, that's just canonically incorrect. Yeah, even and particularly if you live in the Star Trek world, you definitely know that. But then again, maybe they don't know anything about the Borg apparently. But yeah, I think that it's a good point. But yeah, the idea of the kids, I think that the flip side of it is there's this cool moment in the most recent season of For All Mankind, which is co-created by Ron Moore, where one of the characters is able to take her son with her to Mars. And it's set in like an alternate 2003. And there's this cool moment where like if she doesn't do it, it means she won't see her kid for a long time. But it's super dangerous to take her kid to Mars. But it's this cool, empowering moment where it's like, oh, Kelly Baldwin gets to take her son to Mars because that means she gets to be a better parent. Yeah. And
so I think there's something about that Star Trek tried to do with TNG. And they take it too far with the Hansons because they needed to create this tragic backstory. Yeah. But I think it just could have been written slightly differently and it would have been fine. But the way it's written, because we know so much about the Borg, and it seems that they do as well, they seem to know too much about the Borg to have made this decision.
Definitely. And that's the thing. It makes Magnuson come across as very single-minded and determined to the extent that he would jeopardize his family's safety. And that's what's really difficult. Like, if it felt more like we're doing this thing that is exciting and unknown as opposed to what he's doing. It's like, no, we're not going to stop to refuel, and I'm going to stay over there longer than is safe. All these little things that just feel a bit dangerous. You go, okay, but you're a father and you love your child and you love your wife. I get it that there are times that a parent may lean more toward having their family with them, even if it's in a slightly more dangerous situation. This feels extremely more dangerous unless you can do what you're suggesting, which is, okay, let's kind of rewind a bit here and just say that there are so many unknowns for them that it felt okay. Maybe that needed to be translated to the audience a bit better. Also, I'm going to back you up here on your wardrobe notes, because I think Star Trek has a problem with either saying if a species is super advanced, then they're either wearing like togas or medieval robes. That's how you know they're advanced. Or if they're contemporary and they're in civilian clothes, we bought upholstery fabric and we turned that into sweaters. And that's how these costume decisions are made. It's very, very strange.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Magnus is very uncool.
Yeah.
He's dressed poorly. He's a jerk. Mm-hmm. He's not. I think that's the biggest problem. I guess I don't want to say it's a problem with the episode, but it doesn't feel necessarily intentional. Like, it doesn't seem like they intentionally made him like that. We're kind of supposed to feel sorry for the Hansons.
Let me ask you this, though, because if it's not intentional, I think there is an interesting idea here that Seven is really conflicted with the potential lost love of her family, the potential of this lost experience having a family, but also the realization that they did stupid things, particularly under the leadership of Magnus here, asserting himself, that then ruined their lives. So she's got to have this, not just a mixed feeling, but a resentment toward him as well.
I guess it's like if the kids from Jurassic Park, their grandpa got killed and then they got turned into dinosaurs. Yeah. Like, that's what happened. Because he shouldn't have brought them to the island. Yeah, that was the irresponsible decision to bring them to Ilsa Nubar, right? Like the grandpa from Jurassic Park should have done that. And so that if the kids had seen him killed by a velociraptor and then they themselves became velociraptors, that is what 7 of 9 experiences, right?
Yeah.
Because and he's more likable than her parents, but you know what I mean. A similar irresponsible decision, right?
Right.
Like the fact that there are children on Jurassic Park is only because it's written that way, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that, like, the only reason why Seven of Nine had to be assimilated as a child. Now, you could have easily written it that Seven of Nine wasn't assimilated as a child. It just wouldn't have made her backstory as tragic.
Right.
You know what I mean? She could have been assimilated as, like, a tween or something. But, I mean, you know, she's really young, you know, and I think that that's the thing that's so... Philosophically, the thing that's the most uncomfortable about the Seven of Nine character is that, yes, her parents put her in a dangerous situation, and then she just didn't have a childhood, you know, because she was turned into a Borg, you know what I mean? And then, like, and that's something that is trauma that I don't think they start to unpack with the character until Picard. You know what I mean? Like in terms of, like, the really idea that she, like, you know, what kind of person is she? You know, so, but yeah, her parents are, you know, Starfleet CPS should have intervened, right?
Well, honestly, I mean, this is exactly what makes her journey so fascinating, is because, you know, there are lessons of the Borg that are very hard to give up. There's a whole experience from her young childhood into her adulthood where she knows nothing else. Then at the same time, it's like, okay, how does she view her parents? And let's complicate the fact entirely by having the Queen constantly gaslighting her throughout this episode. You know, we let you go. You weren't rescued. We let that happen. And you're a plant. And we're bringing you back because we want you for this. And it plays into the total destabilization of Seven's reality at all. She's having to constantly, like, create who she is and understand who she is, and then to have somebody like the Queen come in and to say, nope, I'm changing that again on you. Really tragic. You know, she's got a tragic backstory and a tragic present as well. And I think all of that really reflects as well on the bizarre cult-like nature of the Borg. It's not just, here's a computer program that is relentless in executing itself. It is also manipulative. Like, there's something about the Queen that is so disturbingly psychologically manipulative. It's not just enough for me to bring you back here. I'm also going to bend you to my will, and I'm going to make you suffer by watching what we do to this other species, and then make you betray the people that have saved you. Like, it's really twisted.
I know writers who, like, are now working as AI jockeys because they lost their jobs or whatever, right? So it's not that different. Right. Yeah. Like, it's not that different. You know, that's the Borg Queen. The Borg Queen is just, you know, OpenAI's CEOs being like, all right, writers, you like what we did? Watch us do it again.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, I think that I mean, I know that I'm kind of harping on the real world implications, but I think that
that's good,
one of the things I like about an episode like this is that and all the points you're bringing up are really interesting for the Star Trekness of it all, but again, I think the Borg stuff works better in this episode now than it did then. Because then I think that my biggest, if I have a critique of the episode, is that it's just, you could do the whole episode without the flashbacks.
Yeah. Yeah. You could.
Or at least a lot fewer of them.
Yeah.
You know, that's just kind of there to pad it out.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, well, we get more of Seven's character, but well, it's right, but it's like this other actor, and then we have to kind of, like, put up with the production values aren't real that great, and it's like, we're kind of, like, already in tricky canon territory anyway, maybe less of that. You know what I mean? Maybe keep those memories more like, you know, we don't... I think that it's an interesting thing to say, what was this person like as a child, but almost never are we happy when we see the child version of Jean-Luc Picard, Luke Skywalker, Seven of Nine. We're almost never are we like, oh, yay. You know, like, we're almost so I think that the flashbacks sort of take up almost too much real estate, whereas all the interesting stuff is what you're talking about.
Well, you know what, Ryan? I think you have perfectly arrived at the place where we need to jump to the final segment and put this in summary and decide if it holds up and what we learned.
If your parents unexpectedly show up for a reunion, you're either on a Borg ship or you're on This Is Your Life. Or perhaps both, since the Borg Queen has a spotlight operator.
All right, we have arrived at the end of our journey with Dark Frontier, parts 1 and 2, the feature-length Voyager episode where we get reacquainted with the Borg Queen. And we ask ourselves, will 7 of 9 really, actually betray Janeway and the crew of Voyager? So, Ryan, as we do at the end of every episode of Mission Log, we ask ourselves a couple of questions. We ask if the episode holds up, and then we ask what the message was and if we learned something. So I'll posit the first part of that to you now. Does Dark Frontier hold up?
I think it does, and I think that it does. As I said, I want fewer flashbacks in an ideal version. I think that the production values in some places are tricky because it doesn't look as good as First Contact, and it was trying to sort of top First Contact. And that always has kind of bothered me about the Borg in Voyager, is that it was like, ooh, but First Contact looks like it was made yesterday.
Yeah.
You know, like it still looks amazing. So then to watch something that was made a few years later that's in the same franchise, in the same universe with similar characters, and be like, that looks like a early aughts Doctor Who.
Yeah.
You know, where you're like, oof. So those elements I find distracting, but it's Star Trek, and so I always overlook those elements because it's not why I watch Star Trek. I think it holds up because it's this Voyager episode that feels like Voyager in cool mode, and that it's the Janeway is holding a phaser rifle and beaming onto the Borg cube at the end, and 7 is facing off with the Borg Queen. It feels big, and it reminds me of what I think about when I think about the big Voyager stakes. And when I rewatched it, the quirkiness of it, you know, all the stuff we were joking about with Neelix and Tom Paris and stuff, the quirkiness of it just gives it that wonderfully innocent Star Trek flavor, right? So like with that, Star Trek has that kind of G-shucks flavor to it that we love. And so I think it has both of those things. I think the episode is better with the Borg stuff now than it was probably then, and that's true of many of the Borg episodes. I think it's got a cool title. I think it's got great dialogue. I think it's got I like the heist thing. You know, yeah. I like Janeway wanting to sort of like steal stuff from the Borg.
Yeah,
you know, like that's kind of like an amazing idea that like Janeway is just like, she says at the beginning, like, you know, I feel lucky today or something. You know what I mean? Like we're like there's this cockiness to Janeway that's really fun. And it sort of fulfills that promise of Voyager where they're on their own. They got to figure it out. So they're going to go to the belly of the beast and try to rip off the Borg.
Right.
And I think that that's all done really well. And yeah, I'd say, I think it totally holds up. It holds up a lot better than a lot of other big Voyager episodes, in my opinion.
Do you think that this would have worked better as a single episode? As a standard length episode, you cut out the flashback stuff and you just really boil down what we're doing with the heist. I mean, we do not waste, but we have pretty much a whole act doing the holodeck simulation. There are places it could be trimmed. Do you think it would have been as good?
I mean, it's tough because it's sort of like talking about the best of both worlds, right? Where like we don't ever really talk about the second episode. You know, where it's like in the original Best of Both Worlds is all build up. So I think there is an element to that here where the build up actually is kind of what makes it what it is. But I think there's a version that's a little shorter. Sure. I think that asking a casual fan to watch an hour and 47 minutes or whatever it is on Paramount Plus is maybe a bit much. And that maybe a tight 50-minute version of this would be okay, if that exists. So maybe. Fair
enough. I think you swayed me a little bit here. I have to admit that this is not the first time I watched this episode, but in my first rewatch and then my subsequent watch to prepare my notes here, I was feeling less enthusiastic about it. Because here's the thing, I like Borg stories, and I think there are good ones to be told. And I'm kind of torn about the Borg Queen. But the more I watched this, I felt like, you know what, I can warm up to the idea of the Borg Queen because, as I've said on Mission Log before, I think the Queen is an emergent property of the Borg. Like, the Queen is just a thing that happens given the right species, given the way the Borg program works itself out. And says, we need drones to do this job. We need these other specialized Borg members to do this other thing. But we're also going to need a queen. Actually, we might need a dozen queens, depending on where we have Borg outposts, in order to kind of run this area. So I have a lot less of a problem with the Queen, and the Queen has personality properties that may work to its advantage. So I'm okay with that. At the same time, I feel like very often the Queen is relied upon as a gimmick. Like, you have this cool special effect, you have this weird seductive quality that she has, and sometimes the story just leans heavily on that. But I really like Seven here because I think she is such a strong character and so interesting. Like, every facet that we get to explore is interesting. And you made a really good point that this is a transitional episode. Look, it was transitional when Seven came aboard. It's transitional every time we get these little hints where, like, okay, she really is giving up her Borg past and trying as hard as she can to fit in with humanity. But now, in terms of storytelling, we've really cemented this idea of the Janeway 7 story, ramping up the action, seeing how this interfaces with the Borg when we encounter them. I think that can be played a little too much. I guess we'll have to see how this goes over the next couple of seasons. But I think there's a lot of good stuff here, and I might be able to let go of some of the things that I felt were holding me back from really being in love with this story. There are always kind of story logic questions with what the Borg are doing. Like, do they really notice them? Do they not? Are they really a threat at this point? Are they not? Stuff like that, you just kind of have to swallow and go like, okay, in order to tell this story, we're letting our characters get away with this. It also feels a bit like a ratings grab. Yeah. Which it is. You know, I said it up front. They had their eye on the Nielsen sweep week and said, we need to make this almost first contact tribute episode. Yeah. To draw people in. But if you do that and you also tell an interesting story with characters that I'm interested to follow, then maybe that's okay. So yeah, I don't think you get Unimatrix Zero without this. And I think that in my memory, this episode was like later in the show. That I thought this episode was like in season 6 or season 7. Oh, okay. And so because I kind of always think like the post-7 era, I kind of always think, oh, everything in season 4 and 5 were kind of boring. Then you go back and like, why Mission Log is so wonderful is like you go, actually, no, they were setting this stuff up for a while. Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I think I like it perhaps slightly more than it deserves, is because I'm like, wow, they were actually doing this in season 5. Yeah. You know, and 7 had not really been on the show that long. Yeah. You know, a season and a half, you know, and so to be taking that big of a swing with her character and to be bringing back the Borg Queen, you know, and you're still 2 seasons out from the end of the show. And kind of like, and again, like now everything we think about Janeway and 7 sort of comes from that era. And I just think that that's really fascinating. Excellent. Well, and then at the end of the day here, of course, we got a heist story, we got an action story, we got Borg ships that blowed up real good. Did we learn anything? Is there a moral meaning or message to take home from this story? I think that for me, it's kind of the thing you alluded to before, which is that when 7 says, you know, my sense of humor is my own, I think it's the idea that the search for personal identity is a singular journey and that the past can sort of inform it, but that you don't necessarily need the past in order to define yourself. And that's a journey that 7 sort of begins anew here. Right, but like sort of just because she's grappling with all the stuff, and then the Borg Queen is part of her past, her parents are part of her past, all that stuff is coming, and then, you know, her present and future is Voyager and Janeway, right? And so she's being sort of given, like you said, the Borg Queen's sort of gaslighting her, but in a way, the going through the logs is kind of gaslighting her too, because it's like confusing her about, you know, she's essentially been a brand new person for like a year, and so I think there's something really cool about and thoughtful and nuanced and sort of under the surface about how long this process is going to be for her, but also how it is doable because ultimately the colleagues she has now are better, right? Like that, you know, and I think that that's something that Star Trek does well with, you know, Kirk and Spock, right? Like, you know, you always got the sense that Spock never really
fit in, and then you get these wonderful episodes like the Tholian Web, where Spock and Bones are like having to bond because they think Kirk is dead, and then there's this new shift in their relationship. So I like the way that Janeway and Seven seem to kind of shift a bit. Even at the beginning, when Janeway sort of tells her that she's the person for this job and it's going to be uncomfortable, it's kind of great because you get the sense that they're like gonna work it out. And it has that family element to Trek, but I think that by putting the journey on a true outsider like Seven, who's a double outsider, because she's not part of Starfleet, she was never part of Starfleet, and she was previously a Borg. So who is she? And that the episode says she can be whoever the hell she wants to be. Right. And I think that is really great, and that's Star Trek to me.
I love that. Well, not quite the same, but maybe a similar exploration of Seven's journey here. I want to contrast what happens to her with what happens in a scene that could be kind of a throwaway in the episode. And it's a scene where Magnus is on board the Borg cube and he's watching what happens to one of the drones who is damaged. Says there was a plasma explosion or something, and you see this Borg kind of stumbling around, and he goes back to the regeneration chamber. He goes, oh, these other Borg came along to help him. Oh, nope, they're not helping him. They are taking him apart and they are recycling the parts to be used for other drones, and they will let whatever organic material is left of this drone die. He has now been, quote, deactivated. And that is how the drones and that is how the Borg collective sees any weakness among their ranks. That is a thing to be excised, to be taken apart and recycled so that we can then focus on the rest of the mission. Contrast that with Seven's journey here. Seven is taken away back to the collective, and Janeway has her doubts, Chakotay has his doubts, but they do the homework and they sit back and try to figure out what actually happened here. And I love that scene with Naomi Wildman coming into Janeway's ready room, having this really lovely, tender moment. And Janeway gives her the 3 rules. She kind of straightens up. She is like, always tuck in your shirt. And wait a minute, always tuck in your shirt, go down with the ship, and never leave anyone behind. And there's something really lovely about that, and it is the inherent lesson for Seven here, which is you never give up on people. And she is the recipient of that lesson here. Even when Seven has done something, quote unquote, bad, she's done something that endangered others or sometimes, obviously, under the influence of others, the crew comes back because they genuinely care. And that is this very human thing that happens. And it speaks to the love of friendship among family, whether they are chosen or otherwise. And that is something that the Borg definitely, by demonstration, do not offer. Mission Log is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com, and for more Star Trek news and discussion, visit trekmovie.com.
On the next Mission Log, the disease.
Some of the music for Mission Log provided by Warp 11, online at warp11.com. Special thanks to consulting producers, Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Shadwell, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi. The Borg Queen has a spotlight operator this time. Next time, maybe she'll have an applause sign and a laugh track. End transmission.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.